I'm John Ridley. I'm the writer and director and producer of the documentary feature Let It Fall, Los Angeles, 1982 to 1992.
Why that film?
It was a subject matter that was very, look, it was very much an obelisk on the timeline of my life. I grew up in the Midwest, which was a very unique and in good ways and in not so good ways, a sheltered experience. I moved to New York City in the mid-1980s, and even though I was moving to a space where I thought a lot of the interactions I had would be more progressive than maybe I had in a small town in the Midwest, a lot more broad-based, I moved to New York at a time when it was about Bernie Goetz and Howard's Beach and Crown Heights, and you realize that issues of distressed racial interaction, they were not things that were relegated to the South or small towns or places like that. That was probably always the case, but for me in my environment, that was a real awakening, that a lot of these issues and a lot of these very extreme issues are not something that are defined by geography or perspective, but they really are about the individuals that you interact with. So I moved out to Los Angeles. Once again, I thought I was moving to a place that was the Los Angeles that I knew from television and from music and from movies and from the '84 Olympics and from We Are the World, where it was just a lot of people that if you were involved in arts and you were involved in expression, they really didn't care about race or background or orientation. That was not the case, clearly. And when I moved out to Los Angeles, there were a lot of people who told me very explicitly, you need to be very careful in your dealings with the police. And these were people of such a wide degree, a varying degree of backgrounds. I realized that there was a real problem out here. But for people who were not necessarily of a particular geographical area, we had no idea. And this was, it was 25 years ago, so for some people who may be viewing this film, this was before cell phones. This was before, if you can imagine how distressed you are at seeing these difficult interactions between the citizenry and police on a regular basis, on YouTube, on Facebook. Imagine what it was like for people to talk about this and talk about this and talk about this, but by happenstance, somebody making a video, not just of a rough arrest, but of a person of color who, by all measures, was incapable of resisting the police being struck 56 times in 80 minutes with metal batons. The way that piece of footage landed, it was a wake-up call for a lot of people, like myself, but that call was coming far too late for a whole other group of individuals who were visited with similar experiences on a far too regular basis. Yeah. So for me, as someone who has been transported to Los Angeles, to see these interactions, and to be a storyteller, and to understand that there is far more to this story than most people knew, than most people witnessed, and certainly more than most people remembered. As we moved on from those events year by year, to answer to your question, that's why I wanted to tell this story, to really provide a space for the people who really experience these events to share their stories, to share their perspectives, to share their recollections with a wider audience.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for doing that. Has this found the 1992 events and everything leading up to it before then?
Yeah.
Has that found its way into your art before this? With 12 Years a Slave, Gorilla, different topics, but has that influence found its way into your art?
Certainly, building towards this subject matter has taken time because I know my emotions immediately following those events, but I think, and I hope, I should say, that with this story that there's a level of maturity for myself, that it's not about my opinion, it's not about my thoughts, but it's creating a space for people who are intimately involved in these set of circumstances, going back 10 years, to have a space where they can share what they lived through. So for me, personally speaking, look, when I was a younger man, Everything I did was more about me. It's more about my perspective, more about John Ridley telling the audience, here's what you should think or feel. But I do think in these later years, I mean, look, when I worked on Red Tails, that was about sitting down with a group of gentlemen who served their country in a very particular way, sharing their story with an audience, and hopefully I was a conduit for that. Same thing with 12 Years a Slave. That was about Solomon, about his story, his memoir, his recollections, and sharing that with an audience. Same with American Crime and Guerrilla. So all of that was a process, I hope, that was preparing me to remove myself, frankly, from the process, other than creating a space where people could feel safe in sharing their very particular stories, and from a very broad perspective. Not just me, not just my experiences, not just my point of view, or not just me inviting a very particular kind of individual to share their story, but really opening it up. Because what happened in Los Angeles, it happened to a very particular demographic, but that wasn't the only demographic that was affected. That wasn't the only demographic that, no pun intended, had skin in the game. And that was not the only demographic that we need to involve in trying to problem solve going forward.
I was watching an interview before, and you said that there was an emotional velocity to the film.
Yeah.
Was that emotional velocity present for you there when you were experiencing this? Because I know it was two different worlds.
Yeah.
You know, you went and you were writing, and you were in a separate portion, and I don't know, I'm only 31, so you know, I was a young guy at that age, a child at that age. What was the emotional climate, and was that emotional velocity present all throughout LA, or was it just parts of LA?
I think it was absolutely throughout Los Angeles, but for a lot of folks who've never been to LA, people have no idea the size of this city, the sprawl of this city. And you know, look, whether it's a large city or there's a small city, we continue to segregate ourselves. You know, even though we have the opportunity to engage with people, we year by year find ways. Some ways are still enforced upon us, very unfortunately. But even though we have the ability to connect in ways that we never had, I mean, look, you go into the digital spaces, and we all seek out those comfortable spaces. We all seek out those spaces where the people we're engaging with tend to be more like us. Their perspectives tend to be more like us. So back in the day in Los Angeles, even though it's a big city, even though it's a city that represents so many different kinds of people from across America and frankly from around the world, you would see these pockets where folks lived. We would drive through those pockets that were different than ours to arrive to our work or go back to our families. That was the separation. So for me personally, when that verdict went down, when I saw what was going on the streets, there was a very particular emotional velocity to what was happening. But as I worked on this story and as I started to engage different communities, I found there was this collective emotional velocity, but they weren't directed towards engagement, they weren't directed towards problem solving, and that was the issue. You had these various plates that were rubbing up against each other, whether it was black, Hispanic, Asian, citizens, police, and you keep getting that friction, and at some point you're going to get some kind of discord, disconnect. That's what happened in Los Angeles, and we can see that happening in different places around the country.
Talk to me a little bit about the experience of this documentary. I know it came to you first, you know, with interest to develop a feature film.
Yeah.
So how did it go from feature film to where it is now?
Well, originally, Spike Lee invited me to work on writing a feature narrative that he was going to direct, and that was about 10 years ago, actually 2006. And everything that attracted to me to this story, the fact that it was obviously very difficult, it was very emotional, the fact that it was very gray. There aren't necessarily clear heroes in the traditional sense. There are a lot of everyday people who rise to the occasion. They're not necessarily clear villains. They're people who do things that are reprehensible, but they didn't necessarily wake up in the morning and say, look, I'm going to go out and do ill to my fellow human being. There were systemic issues. There were systemic problems. But at the end, for an audience watching this story, there's an expectation of seeing those issues rendered on a very grand scale. We're talking about an uprising in Los Angeles that affected tens of thousands of people, quite frankly. So all of those elements made it very difficult to go to a studio and say, hey, here's where we want to put your money into something that doesn't have necessarily one point of view, has many points of view, is not heroic, is not demonizing, but needs to be rendered in a way that, frankly, is going to cost a great deal of money.
Could we tell that story now? With Detroit just coming out and, other films that are just like it,
Unfortunately, I don't think we can. You look at a film like Detroit and you see how sensitive people are, rightly or wrongly, to so many issues that are involved in something that is based on history. And you see, frankly, that despite the fact that by all measures the film was made with the intent to have a positive impact on people, the audience didn't necessarily go and see that. I think some people think, well, they look at it, well, that film it's not geared for me, it's geared for another audience. Or, for the audience that perhaps people might assume it's geared for, they look at it and go, well why do I want to put myself through that emotional turmoil again? Or that's a story that I've seen before, whether they have or they haven't. So I think it becomes difficult, at least in the traditional film space, to make these kinds of films and for a studio to say, okay, well, there's an audience there the way there'd be an audience for a Marvel film, the way there'd be an audience for a Star Wars film. And by the way, across the board, that is a challenge for filmmakers. If you want to make a story about anything that may be distressful, anything that may be politicized, even if your intent isn't to make it a political story, people do arrive at their agendas at place. But we also see similarly, at the same time, the rise in the documentary filmmaking. Whose streets is it? There's another documentary film coming out of Milwaukee, Blood at the Doorsteps. It was also about a police shooting in Milwaukee. We have Let It Fall, the film that I'm working on. Documentarians, there's probably no better time to be a documentarian because the audience has grown so much. But also there's a secondary market with Netflix, with Hulu, with these other spaces. So people who like documentaries, there's a broad range. You can sit down and watch them day and night. Well, back in the day, if you didn't catch it in a theater, maybe potentially there might be a VHS or a DVD, but even that, even though there was an explosion in that home market, it wasn't commensurate with the growth for traditional films that were on DVD. So now with streaming, I do think a lot of the subject matter that people who write the checks may look at and go, well, look, it's terrific, and we see an emotional value in telling that story. There may not necessarily be a financial value. There is increasingly, you look at how well 13th did. You look at how well I'm Not Your Negro did. OJ, slightly different circumstance, but obviously a very impactful documentary. We can expect to see more of that, and that's a good thing.
So digital distribution is changing the landscape for
Absolutely.
Documentaries. How is digital distribution changing the landscape for film in general?
Well, for storytelling in general, the opportunities for individuals to go out to make the films they want to make, tell the stories they want to tell, and put them in front of some kind of an audience. Again, there's no better time. The technology, the equipment, the infrastructure, and quite frankly, the socializing with purpose. If you're an actor but don't know necessarily someone who can help you write a script, you can get online. You can find people who can do that. You can find people who have equipment. You can find people who can not only edit, but Avid they put out a free version of their software just recently. It is a skinny version. Everybody likes to throw the word skinny around next to everything. But listen, the fact that you can get professional level software for free and start to learn that, that is going to really start changing the landscape, because people who want to, money is no longer an absolute hindrance. Finances are no longer an absolute hindrance. So there's an opportunity for people to get together, to co-op, to put their stories that they want to tell together and do it in a way that it can really impact other individuals and be disruptive in the most positive sense.
Talk to me about your journey. How did you get to where you are? And I know, it's been
no idea.
Just got into a car and drove across.
In some ways, yes. In some ways, literally. Got into a car and drove to Los Angeles. Like anyone else, there are elements that it really does involve hard work. It involves being selfish, hopefully in good ways. It involves understanding the things that I want to accomplish, and then to a degree being ignorant of the challenges and not really caring about the challenges in some regards. You know, you said something to me before the camera started rolling, that sometimes it's not waiting for other people to give you permission to do the things that you want to do. And I think that's really one of the most important things for people to understand. Even now with digital media, even now with a lower barrier of access for a lot of people, they still think about, well, you know, I want to make a movie for Hollywood, or it doesn't count if it's not done from what we traditionally conceive of as being Hollywood. I mean, look, what is considered to be Hollywood has given me probably every blessing that I have in my professional life. And frankly, some of that has spilled over into my personal life as well. But folks don't need other people's permission to tell the stories that they want to tell. And one of the things that, you know, I engage with, and it's still very difficult, because even though we see more people who look like me, and in some ways, more importantly, people who don't necessarily look like me telling stories, it remains rare. It remains far too rare. And at my age, when I do work, you know, people come with their expectations of, great, we're glad you're doing it, but why didn't you do that? Or why didn't you add that? And I do find myself now as an older person saying, I probably am part of the structure and the infrastructure of Hollywood. So whatever you find in my film that inspires you, great, but also things that you don't find, let that inspire you as well. So, you know, don't wait for my permission either. Don't wait for someone like me to roll through town. If you have something that drives you, that inspires you, that quite frankly frustrates you, that's the only permission you need to go off and do the things that you want to do. Hi, I'm John Ridley. I'm the director of the documentary Let It Fall, Los Angeles, 1982 to 1992. Please feel free to check it out.